I heard my son's voice crack on 2 words before I'd even gotten my key back into my purse. "Mom, please hide." Something in my body understood before my mind caught up that the next 60 seconds were going to cost him more than he realized he was spending. My name is Cleotha Calloway, and in 26 years of raising that boy alone, he had never once asked me to disappear before that Tuesday. I'd driven across town with a foil pan of food still warm against my hip because he'd texted that morning saying he missed my cooking, expecting nothing stranger than a hug and an empty refrigerator. He grabbed my wrist before the door even shut behind me, his face gone pale, his words fast and low. He had spent 3 years building a version of himself for that family, and I watched it crack in real time before either of us said another word. Prescott, Geneva, and Selena had stopped by unannounced after a venue walkthrough 2 blocks over, he said. "And they don't like you. Please, just hide." I did not argue with my son. I set the pan down on his counter, picked my purse back up off the chair, and moved toward the hallway with the kind of calm that comes from a lifetime of making myself smaller for people who never once asked me to. Before I go any further, I'd like to know where you're watching this from tonight, because what happened in the next minute is the kind of thing that stays inside a woman for the rest of her life, and I want to know whose evening I'm sitting inside of while I tell it. The front door opened with a key instead of a knock, the sound of people who'd been told they belonged in that apartment whether anyone was home or not. I turned the corner with my coat half on, and there he stood, a broad man in a tailored blazer, a woman beside him in pearls, who said nothing at all, not a greeting, not my name, her silence telling me exactly what kind of family my son was trying to disappear into, and behind them, the uncertain face of the young woman my son intended to marry. The man's eyes moved over me once, my plain blouse, my flat shoes, the purse I'd carried since before David finished college, and he asked the question with no malice in his voice at all, which somehow made it worse. "David, is this your cleaner?" I watched my son's mouth open. I watched him look at me for exactly 1 second, long enough for me to see 3 years of chasing a future inside her father's company pass behind his eyes. 3 years of small silences and skipped dinners, and excuses I'd let myself believe were nothing. Then he looked back at that man and answered without a single stammer, "Yes, for sure." I did not cry. I did not correct him. I turned my body fully toward my son, the same body that carried him 9 months and worked nights so he'd never once go hungry. And I understood exactly what he'd just sold and exactly who he'd sold it to. And the hurt I felt did not break me. It settled into something colder and steadier than hurt has ever been allowed to settle in me before. I said one sentence to him, quiet enough that only the people standing in that doorway would ever hear it. "You'll understand how well I can clean. How about that?" Then I walked past all 4 of them, out his door, into a part of this story none of them saw coming. The 40-minute drive home gave me time to count backward through every excuse I had swallowed without naming it. Every holiday David spent with Selena's family instead of mine. Every birthday call cut shorter than the year before. Every time I told myself a grown man building a life just gets busy. I called Marva before I'd even pulled into my driveway because I needed to say what happened out loud to someone who would not let me talk myself out of how it felt. She was quiet on the other end while I told her about the doorway, the question, the answer, and when I finished, she said the thing I did not want to hear yet. "You're not even mad, Cleotha," she said. "You sound like you're already deciding how to be calm about it." I told her calm was the only thing that had ever kept me standing upright, and she pushed back harder than I expected from a woman who'd known me 20 years. "Sometimes calm is wisdom," she said. "And sometimes it's just you letting that boy off easy one more time." I didn't answer her right away, because some part of me knew she wasn't entirely wrong, and the not answering told her more than anything I could have said. I went inside, made tea I didn't drink, and told myself the only thing I had any real control over that night was my own business, not my son's choices. I opened my laptop at the kitchen table to finish the one piece of work still sitting unfinished, a proposal for a janitorial contract on a redevelopment project along the Beltline corridor, the kind of bid that could double what Callaway Cleaning Services brought in over the next 3 years, if it landed right. I had been putting off the final pages for 2 weeks, distracted by 3 other accounts closing at once, and I told myself finishing it tonight was simply good business, nothing more. A way to keep my hands busy doing something that still belonged entirely to me. I pulled up the client file to confirm the submission portal one last time before I went any further, and that is when I saw the name printed plainly at the top of the page, the company requesting the bid. Marsh Development. I sat with my hands still on the keyboard, not moving, reading it again slower the second time in case my eyes had simply rearranged letters out of exhaustion. Marsh was not a name I had heard 1,000 times in this city. It was a name I had heard exactly once, months earlier. The one time David let it slip before he started keeping me at a distance. The name of the family Selena came from. I told myself there were surely other Marshes in a city this size, other companies sharing a common surname with no connection to my son's life at all. And I said that to myself twice before I stopped believing it either time. Marva called back 20 minutes later to check on me, and when I told her what I'd just found on my own screen, she went quiet in a different way than before, the kind of quiet that comes from 2 women realizing the same hand might be moving more pieces on this board than either of us had counted. I closed the laptop without finishing the final pages, because I did not yet know what this name on this building actually meant for me, only that it was not nothing, and that whatever it turned out to be, it had found its way to my inbox before I'd even had a full day to grieve what happened in that doorway. My phone rang 4 times before noon the next day, and by evening, David's name had flashed across the screen 10 times more, and I let every single one ring itself out to voicemail. I was not punishing him by staying quiet. I needed 1 full day where my hands were busy doing something I knew how to do well before I let his voice back into my ear. Callaway Cleaning Services ran 6 crews across the city that morning, and I drove out to a medical plaza off the Beltline myself, walking the lobby floor with my own 2 hands testing the shine my own training had taught a dozen women to leave behind. Because moving through a building I'd built a reputation in reminded me exactly who I was outside of anybody's doorway. My phone rang again around noon, but this time it was a number I recognized from the bid portal, an assistant from Marsh Development asking whether Callaway Cleaning Services could move our presentation up by a full week, since the building's ownership wanted vendor selection finalized ahead of an early opening date. I agreed, professional and even, and hung up before I let myself feel the strange tightness moving through my chest at hearing that name spoken to me directly by someone inside that company. David showed up on my porch that evening without calling first, the same blazer from the doorway still on his back, his eyes red in a way that told me he hadn't slept much either. I let him in because I did not raise a coward, even one apparently capable of becoming one. He sat across from me at my own kitchen table and told me, finally, the full shape of what he'd been telling Selena's family for the better part of a year. First, it was that I lived 2 states away and rarely visited. Then, once that story grew too thin to maintain, he told them I had passed away nearly 2 years ago, a lie he said out loud to me with his eyes down on the table. He told them I'd spent my whole life cleaning hotel rooms for other people, that I'd never owned a thing of my own in this world, when the truth sitting 2 miles from his apartment was a company with my name on the door and 17 people on payroll who depended on me every week to get it right. He said it all because Prescott Marsh ran his company on a particular image of what a partner's family should look like, and David had been terrified for months that the truth of where he came from would cost him the future he was chasing. I let the silence sit between us longer than was comfortable, before I asked him plainly whether he understood that I had been alive this entire time, working, paying my own bills, building a company, while he told an entire family I no longer existed. He did not have an answer worth repeating. He reached for my hand across the table, and I did not take it, because forgiveness offered that cheap, that fast, after a lie that size, would have taught him nothing at all about what he had actually done. I told him I needed more from him than an apology delivered out of panic at being caught. He left an hour later with nothing settled between us, no forgiveness extended, no plan made. And as his car pulled away from my curb, I sat back down at that same table and reminded myself the presentation was now 7 days away, closer than it had been that morning, closer than David, yet understood it had any right to be. My phone rang on a Sunday morning with a voice I hadn't heard in months, a florist I'd used for every wedding and repast Callaway cleaning services ever catered around, calling to tell me something she said she couldn't sit on any longer. She told me Selena had been asking strange questions around her own bridal party, wanting to know whether anyone recognized an older woman who'd been at David's apartment the week before, a woman David had told her father's family was the cleaner. I asked her plainly what David had told Selena himself, and she said David claimed it had been the wrong apartment entirely, a mix-up with a unit 2 floors down, a lie so thin I sat there shaking my head at my own kitchen table, wondering how a boy I raised to look people in the eye had learned to lie that easily to a woman he claimed to love. She told me Selena hadn't believed him for 1 second and had started going through old photographs from before David learned to scrub his own history clean for an audience he was trying to impress. "Listen," she said, her voice dropping the way it does when she's about to say something she knows will land hard. Selena found pictures from his graduation, captions in his own handwriting, your name spelled out plain. Could not have done this without my mother, the strongest woman I know. I remembered that day clearly enough, sitting under a tent that smelled like cut grass, watching him cross that stage in a cap 2 sizes too big, how he grabbed my hand before the ceremony started and told me none of it happens without you. And I had believed, foolishly, that those words were the truest thing he would ever say to me out loud. She told me I should call Selena myself, set the record straight before David found a way to bury it deeper, and I told her no, not yet. "Why not?" she asked, frustration sharpening her voice. "You have the truth sitting right in your hand." I told her some truths land harder when nobody hands them to you. They only land that way when a person finds them on their own. And anything I said to that girl right now would sound like a mother fighting for her son's marriage instead of a woman simply telling the truth. She pushed back once more, told me she didn't understand how I could sit on my hands while a young woman dug through her own fiancé's lies alone, and I told her I wasn't sitting on my hands. I was simply choosing not to do my son's confessing for him. I hung up that morning and did not call David to warn him, and did not call Selena to help her, because some part of me understood that whatever Selena was building in her own quiet hours, brick by brick with old photographs and unanswered questions, belonged to her to finish on her own terms, not mine, to hand her early. I went back to my own work that day, sharpening the final pages of the bid I had 4 days left to perfect, and let myself believe, for a few hours at least, that I had no real part left to play in whatever Selena decided to do with what she had already started finding. Restraint has never once made me foolish, and I trusted that whatever she was building toward would arrive eventually, on a day neither of us could yet predict, carrying more weight than anything I could have handed her over the phone. I printed the final page of my pitch folder 2 days before the rescheduled presentation. Callaway Cleaning Services across the cover in the navy lettering I'd chosen myself 14 years ago. My own name beneath it. Founder and principal owner. And for 1 quiet minute sitting alone at my desk, I let myself feel exactly as proud as that page deserved, before I let the rest of it back in. The rest of it was this. The folder in my hands was addressed to Marsh Development, the same family that had stood in David's doorway and decided I was hired help before they'd heard a single word out of my mouth. Marva came by the office that afternoon to drop off supply invoices and found me staring at the cover page instead of filing it. And she asked me outright what I thought I was doing. "Walk away from this one, Cleotha," she said, setting the invoices down harder than she needed to. "You don't owe that family a single hour of your time, not after what that boy let them call you." I told her I wasn't doing this for David, and she said that was exactly the problem. Because whether I meant to or not, walking into that boardroom would look to everyone like I was trying to fix what David broke by proving myself worthy of people who'd already shown me who they were. I sat with that accusation longer than I wanted to, because some small, ugly part of me knew she wasn't entirely wrong, that some thread of this had tangled itself around wanting Prescott Marsh to see exactly what his future son-in-law had dismissed in that doorway. Marva pushed harder. "Pride's not a strategy," she said. "It's just pride wearing a blazer." I told her she was right that I wanted Prescott Marsh to see me clearly, but wrong about why. Because what I wanted had nothing to do with revenge and nothing to do with David at all. 14 years ago, I built this company out of one bucket and a borrowed truck, scrubbing grout on my knees in a dental office at midnight while David did his homework in the back seat because I couldn't afford a sitter. And nobody in that dental office ever once asked my name either. Long before David was lying to anybody, long before Selena or her father existed in my world at all, I had already stopped letting other people's assumptions decide what my work was worth. I trusted the numbers instead, the safety record, the years of nights I never missed, because numbers don't change their story depending on who ends up reading them. I told Marva the bid had never actually been about the Marsh family. It was about whether Callaway Cleaning Services could win the largest contract in its history, on the strength of its numbers alone, the same way it had won every contract before this one. And if Prescott Marsh happened to be sitting in that room when it did, that was simply where the math had led me, not where my pride had dragged me. Marva went quiet, the kind of quiet that meant she'd stopped arguing because she believed me now more than she had a minute earlier. I sealed the folder myself that evening and drove it to the submission office before the courier service closed, sliding it across the counter to a clerk who logged it without looking up. The presentation was 2 days out now, a stack of folders just like mine already waiting somewhere on the other side of that building. Mine among them, with no way yet to know whose eyes would land on it first. I walked into the 31st floor conference room expecting a procurement director and maybe 2 analysts, the way every other vendor presentation in this city had gone for 14 years. And instead, I found Prescott Marsh himself sitting at the head of the table, his suit jacket buttoned, his face giving away nothing about the doorway he'd stood in weeks earlier. I recognized him instantly. I do not know if he recognized the recognition crossing my own face, because I did not let it show for longer than a breath. I set my folder down and delivered the pitch I had rehearsed a dozen times in my car, walking through our safety record, our staffing model, our client retention across 2 hospital systems, and a downtown convention center, refusing to let 1 ounce of that doorway bleed into the only thing that mattered in that room, the quality of my work. Prescott asked sharp questions throughout, the kind that told me he had read every page of the proposal himself, rather than skimming a summary somebody else prepared for him. "How do you retain people at the rate you're claiming?" he asked at one point, when most of this industry can't keep a crew past a year. I told him the truth, that I pay above market and show up to job sites myself often enough that my staff never wonders whether anyone notices their work. His tone carried something I had not expected walking in, real respect, the kind that comes from a man testing whether the work behind a folder is as solid as the folder claims. When the formal presentation ended, he asked everyone else in the room to step out, and I watched 2 analysts and a building manager file past me without a word, while something tightened low in my chest. The door closed, and Prescott sat back in his chair and was quiet longer than felt comfortable, before he told me he owed me an apology for a question he had no business asking in a doorway. he had no business walking into uninvited. I told him the apology belonged most directly to my son, who answered that question without hesitation. His jaw tightened at that. He told me, with an honesty I had not expected from a man wrapped this tightly in polish, that his own father had spent 31 years as a maintenance worker, coming home every night smelling of bleach, and that Prescott had spent his entire adult life building distance between himself and that smell. Then he said the part that surprised me more. He told me that when he saw me standing in that doorway, the very first word his mind reached for was cleaner. Not mother, not guest, not a person at all, and that he had spent every day since trying to understand why his mind went there first, when nothing in his life had ever taught him that word belonged to a woman's face before her name did. I did not offer him comfort for that confession because comfort was not what either of us needed sitting in that room. I told him Callaway Cleaning Services would be honored to service this building, and that whatever happened between his daughter and my son was a separate matter entirely, one I had no intention of using as leverage at his table. He extended his hand, and this handshake carried a different weight than the first one outside that doorway had. The weight of two people who had each spent a lifetime being underestimated by rooms exactly like the one we were standing in. 3 days later, his office called to tell me Callaway Cleaning Services had won the contract, on the strength of the numbers alone, with no mention of David, no mention of Selena, no mention of anything that had happened in that doorway at all. Selena walked into my office on a Wednesday afternoon without calling ahead, her phone already in her hand. The screen turned toward me before I'd even stood up from my desk. The graduation photograph filled the screen, my own face younger by years, David's arm around my shoulders, his own handwriting underneath it. Marva let her straight through without asking who she was, the way people sometimes walk past family they've never been properly introduced to. "Tell me the truth," Selena said. "No greeting first. Just that. I want to know if you own this company, if you're the same woman my father just gave the largest contract in his company's history." I told her plainly, yes, the same woman, the same company, 14 years built from nothing, and the same woman David called the cleaner in his own doorway in front of her family. She glanced around my office while I said it. The framed contracts on the wall, the route maps Marva kept pinned by the door, taking in a version of me David had clearly never described to her in any real detail. I did not soften any part of it for her, not the years I spent scrubbing floors before I could afford to hire anyone else to scrub them, not the months David spent keeping me at a careful distance from her life, not the lie he told that I had passed away rather than risk her family learning the truth about where he came from. She lowered her eyes for a moment. Then she asked the question I could tell had been bothering her most. Why would he think he had to do that? I told her she would have to ask David that herself. The only thing I knew for certain was that people tell lies for reasons all the time, but the reason never changes the fact that they told them. She nodded slowly, not defending him, not condemning him, simply trying to understand how someone she planned to marry had become a stranger in front of her. She sat down across from my desk without being asked, her hands very still in her lap, and told me she had learned about the boardroom from her father 2 nights earlier, that he'd come home and told her everything, his own apology, the contract, and the conversation they shared afterward. I told her the part he likely hadn't, that David's lie had cost him very little until the day it was exposed. No missed meals, no lost opportunities, no real consequences at all, while the cost landed squarely on the people expected to carry the humiliation for him. Selena looked away when I said that, not because she disagreed, because she understood it. The silence that followed stretched long enough that I let it stay. Some people need quiet more than advice. Finally, she spoke. "I don't know what this means for the wedding." The honesty in her voice surprised me more than certainty would have. I told her she didn't owe me any decision about her future. This conversation wasn't about choosing sides. It was about understanding what had happened. She nodded. Then she told me something that surprised me. "Whatever happens next," she said, "I'm not making any decision until David stops explaining himself to everyone except the person he actually hurt." I asked her what she meant. She met my eyes directly. "The next real conversation has to be between you and him. Not me, not my father, not anybody else. You, alone, no audience, no performance, no consequences hanging over his head except the truth. I won't decide anything about our future until I know that conversation happened the way it should." I sat back in my chair and considered that. It was the first thing anyone had said since the doorway that felt entirely focused on the right problem. Not the wedding, not the contract, not her father's opinion. The wound itself. I told her I couldn't promise what that conversation would settle, only that I had no intention of running from it. She stood a moment later, thanked me quietly, and headed for the door. As I watched her leave, it struck me that she looked nothing like a woman preparing for a wedding. She looked like a woman trying to decide whether she truly knew the man she had agreed to marry. David showed up at my door on a Thursday evening with nothing in his hands, no flowers, no food, no rehearsed line waiting at the ready, just his own 2 empty palms, and a posture I had not seen on him since he was 9 years old and broke a window 2 doors down and walked home already crying before anyone even asked him what happened. I let him in. He sat at my kitchen table and told me Selena had sent him, that she would not move forward with anything between them until this conversation happened the way it needed to. Alone. No audience. I told him I already knew and watched something in his shoulders drop further, the last thread of performance leaving his body, his hands flat on the table the way they used to lie when he was small and bracing for a scolding he knew he'd earned. He told me the lie had never really started in that doorway. It started years earlier, the first time a boy in his fraternity asked why his mother looked nothing like him, and he'd laughed it off instead of correcting it. He told me he never corrected anyone after that. Not at internships, not at networking dinners, not once in 3 years with Selena's family, because silence was easier than watching anyone's face change the way that boy's had. The laughing off became a habit he never noticed forming until it had built itself into something he could no longer take back. He said he had spent his whole life able to choose, in any room, whether to be seen as his father's son or mine. And somewhere along the way, he started choosing the version of himself that cost him less. Every single time. I listened to all of it without interrupting once, because I had learned long ago that the only useful thing a mother can do in a moment like this is let her child hear his own choices, spoken back in his own voice, even while some part of me ached watching the boy I raised explain away the man he'd let himself become. When he finished, he asked me to forgive him, his voice cracking on the word in a way that nearly moved me before I caught myself. I told him forgiveness wasn't the thing standing between us, understanding was, and I needed him to sit inside the difference before I gave him anything resembling peace. I told him about the contract, that Callaway Cleaning Services had won the largest deal in its history under my own name, in his future father-in-law's own boardroom, without his help, without his protection, without him in the room at all. I watched his face change slowly while I said it, piece by piece, as he understood that the thing he believed he'd been protecting me from, exposure, embarrassment, his fiancé's family's judgment had never actually been mine to fear in the first place. He had not been protecting me. He had been ashamed of me and called it protection so he wouldn't have to look at the difference. He did not have an answer for that. He left that evening without the forgiveness he came for, and I watched his taillights pull away from my curb before I said, out loud to an empty kitchen, that real change was not a feeling he could produce at my table in one sitting. It was a year of choosing differently in rooms where nobody was watching to grade him for it, and that was the only thing I had any interest in waiting for. Geneva came to my house on a Saturday morning without calling first, her turn, it seemed, now that her husband and her future son-in-law had each already sat across from me in their own separate reckonings. I let her in and sat her down in my front room with tea I'd actually had time to prepare properly this time. She told me she had not been able to stop thinking about the doorway since the day it happened, that she had stood 3 feet from her own future grandchildren's grandmother and said absolutely nothing while David erased me in front of everyone. I told her the apology she was circling belonged most directly to David, not to her. She shook her head at that, gently but firmly. Silence in the presence of someone else's cruelty is its own kind of choice, she said, and I don't want to hand mine off to somebody else just because his was louder. I let her sit with that a moment because she wasn't wrong, and I had no interest in arguing a woman out of taking ownership of something she'd clearly already claimed for herself. I asked her plainly why she'd really come, since an apology alone didn't usually require a folder tucked under someone's arm the way hers was. She looked down at the folder before answering. Then she slid it across the coffee table toward me. Inside were photographs, not old family records, not legal documents. Photographs. David and Selena at charity events. Company dinners, holiday parties, fundraisers, years' worth of pictures. I turned page after page. The same thing appeared almost every time. Families, parents, grandparents, children, people standing openly beside one another. Geneva watched me quietly while I looked through them. "Do you know what I realized after the doorway?" she asked. I shook my head. I realized I never once asked David about his family. Not properly. Not because he stopped me. Because I assumed I already knew enough. I looked up at her. She gave a small, disappointed smile. The truth is, we spent years learning everything about David except where he came from. What schools he attended, what projects he worked on, what goals he had. But not the people who raised him, not the woman who built him. And somehow, that never seemed strange to any of us. I couldn't argue with that, because it wasn't strange to them until the day it became impossible to ignore. Geneva told me she had spent the last 2 weeks replaying every dinner, every gathering, every conversation where David had been welcomed into their lives, while the subject of his family quietly stayed untouched, not forbidden, just avoided. The kind of avoidance respectable people get very good at pretending not to notice. "We made it easy for him," she said softly. Maybe not intentionally, but easy all the same. Easy to leave pieces out. Easy to keep people separate. Easy to build a version of himself he thought we'd accept more readily. I sat quietly with that, because it was the first apology I'd heard since the doorway that wasn't focused on a single moment. It was focused on the conditions that made that moment possible. Before she left, she asked whether I would consider coming to dinner at their house the following week. Not as David's mother brought along out of obligation this time. Not as somebody being evaluated. As a woman she genuinely wanted to know. I told her I'd think about it. Because trust broken in a doorway doesn't rebuild itself over one conversation, however honest. She nodded, understanding that fully. Then she stood and gathered her purse. At the front door, she paused. "For what it's worth," she said. I don't think David was the only person hiding that day. I asked her what she meant. She gave me a sad smile. I think the rest of us were hiding from what we already knew about ourselves. Then she stepped outside and headed toward her car. I stood in the doorway a long moment after she left, thinking about the difference between a mistake and a culture. One belongs to a person. The other belongs to everyone who helped make the mistake feel safe enough to happen. Prescott called my office on a Monday morning and asked if he could stop by before the end of the day. He said there was something David needed to hear from him, and because the situation touched both our families now, he wanted to speak with me first. I told him to come after 5, once my crews were back and the phones had quieted down. And he arrived exactly on time. No folder this time, nothing in his hands at all. It struck me, watching him settle into the chair across from my desk, how strange it was that the father of the woman my son hoped to marry now sat in my office discussing consequences neither of us would have imagined a year earlier. He told me plainly what had already been decided. David was being removed from the development track entirely and reassigned to property operations. No negotiations, no client-facing deals, no fast-track advancement. For the foreseeable future, his responsibilities would involve the day-to-day work of managing properties, responding to tenant concerns, coordinating maintenance issues, and rebuilding trust the same way every other employee had, to rebuild it after damaging it. His compensation would be lower, his path forward slower. The opportunities he had spent years chasing were no longer waiting for him where he left them. I sat quietly. Some part of me, the part that had carried that boy for 9 months, wanting to ask Prescott to leave him some thread of hope to hold on to. Then I remembered how many years David had spent holding on to hope he hadn't earned. I asked the question anyway. What happens if he proves himself in 6 months? Prescott didn't soften. There isn't a timeline, he said. No 6 months, no year, no finish line he can count down toward. If he earns his way back, it happens because the work proves it over time, not because a calendar runs out. I studied him for a moment, trying to decide whether what sat across from me was conviction or performance. I'd met enough successful men to know the difference mattered. Finally, I asked why he felt the need to tell me any of this before speaking to David. Because this stopped being only a workplace issue the day it happened in that doorway, he said. David works for my company, but he's also a young man connected to both our families now. I'm not asking your permission. I just didn't think you should hear about it afterward from somebody else. That answer landed differently than I expected. More honest, less polished. I asked him whether he believed David could come back from this. He thought about it before answering. I believe people show you who they are twice, he said. Once when they make a mistake, then again when they have to live with it. The second part tells you more than the first. I sat with that a moment. Then I told him it sounded real to me, mostly because he hadn't come looking for praise. He hadn't asked me to make it easier. He hadn't asked me to agree. He was simply prepared to hold the line. He nodded once, the kind of nod that closes a decision rather than opens a negotiation. Before he left, I asked the question that had been sitting underneath everything else since the doorway. Did any of this change where the wedding stood? Prescott looked at me steadily. That decision never belonged to me, he said. It belongs to Selena, always has, and I have no intention of pretending otherwise. A few moments later, he stood, thanked me for my time, and left the way he'd come, carrying the weight of a conversation he still had ahead of him. I sat at my desk a long while after he was gone, surprised by how much relief I felt watching a man refuse to confuse accountability with cruelty. The two get mistaken for each other far more often than people admit. 6 months into whatever Prescott had built for him, David showed up at my warehouse on a Sunday afternoon without calling first, dressed in old clothes instead of a blazer, and asked if he could help restock supplies before Monday's routes went out. I handed him a clipboard and let him work, because there was nothing left to perform for in a room full of bleach bottles and folded uniforms. No Marsh family watching, no Selena, no version of himself he needed to manage. We counted cases of all-purpose cleaner together in the back closet, and somewhere between the third shelf and the fourth, he asked me, careful, almost afraid of the answer, whether Prescott had said anything to me about how this year was actually going on his end. I told him Prescott had mentioned, during a routine contract check-in, that David had never once asked for an exception to the terms set for him, which had genuinely surprised a man who builds towers for a living and rarely gets surprised by anyone underneath him. David went quiet at that, setting a case down harder than it needed to be set down. And then the old fear surfaced in his voice, the way it used to before any of this happened. What if I do all of this right? And it still isn't enough, he said, not looking at me. What if some part of me is always going to be the man who got caught in that doorway, no matter how long I hold the line afterward? I told him fear like that doesn't disappear on a schedule. It just gets quieter the longer you refuse to let it choose for you instead of letting you choose. He kept stacking boxes after that, and I let the silence between us do some of the work conversation couldn't. Prescott told me something else during that same check-in, I said, watching his hands pause on a case of glass cleaner. He told me you'd started mentoring 2 of the junior property associates under you. Nobody asked you to. Nobody's tracking it on any review. You just started doing it. David told me one of them had nearly quit after a tenant screamed at him over a maintenance delay that wasn't even his fault. And David had sat with the boy on his lunch break and told him the job wasn't the problem, the shame of thinking he deserved. The screaming was. He said the boy reminded him of himself 3 years ago, scared and overcorrecting in every direction at once, and he hadn't wanted to watch that happen to someone else without saying something. I felt something shift in my chest, hearing that, the first real glimpse I'd had of who he might actually become once this year finished doing whatever it was doing to him, separate from any contract, any wedding, any audience at all. Before he left that evening, he asked me straight, standing in the closet doorway with a clipboard still in his hand, whether I actually believed a person could become someone different in 12 months. I told him 12 months wasn't what changed a person. The daily decision not to lie inside those 12 months was. And that answer sat in the room a long moment without either of us fully satisfied by it. Him because he wanted certainty I couldn't honestly give him, and me because some part of me still needed proof I hadn't yet been handed. I did not tell him which way I leaned because some questions only get answered honestly by the months still left to come, not by anything either of us could say out loud in a supply closet on a Sunday. Marva came into my office on a Tuesday with a look on her face I hadn't seen since the week David's lie first unraveled, and she told me one of our crew leads at the Marsh building had overheard something the night before that she thought I needed to know. Our team works the executive floor after hours, she said, emptying trash cans and wiping down conference tables long after everyone else has gone home. The kind of work that makes people forget anyone's still in the room with them. She told me a senior associate named Terrence Boykin had stayed late with another associate, talking in a way that didn't sound like ordinary office gossip, and our crew lead had caught one line clearly enough to repeat it back word for word. Some people never recover from the reputation they earn. I asked Marva what the conversation was actually about, and she told me Terrence had been bringing up David's name again, months after most people inside the company had already moved on. The version he was telling wasn't entirely false, which made it more dangerous. David's future in-laws had walked into his apartment. His mother had been there. A lie had been exposed. But Terrence was leaving out everything that came afterward. He left out the fact that David had admitted what he'd done. He left out the consequences. He left out the year Prescott had made him spend rebuilding trust from the ground up. He left out the fact that the woman in the story owned the company, servicing the very building they worked in. What remained was a version just true enough to repeat and just incomplete enough to damage somebody. I sat with that a long moment because I knew something David was only beginning to learn. A mistake rarely follows you as far as the story people decide to tell about it afterward. Marva told me David had mentioned in passing that a few responsibilities he'd once handled were still being routed around him, even after months of solid work. Not because anyone openly questioned his performance, but because trust, once damaged, tends to move back slower than opportunity moves away. I thought about him in that warehouse months earlier, stacking supplies beside me on a Sunday afternoon, trying for the first time in years to become someone different from the man who stood in that doorway. For most of his life, I'd been angry at the lie. Now, unexpectedly, I found myself angry at the people determined to make sure the lie was the only thing anybody remembered. David had earned the consequences that followed his choices. What he had not earned was a lifetime sentence for a mistake he had spent the better part of a year trying to correct. Marva told me our crew lead described Terrence's voice as calm, careful, almost rehearsed. Not emotional, not frustrated, intentional. The kind of tone people use when they're testing how a story sounds before deciding who else to tell it to. I asked whether she thought Terrence was building towards something larger. She shrugged. Maybe. Maybe not. Sometimes people spread stories because they're angry. Sometimes they spread them because somebody else's stumble creates room for their own success. Terrence had spent years working toward opportunities David once seemed destined to receive. That fact alone was enough to make me pay attention. I looked out my office window for a long moment before answering. Then keep your eyes open, I told her. Nothing more. If Terrence was simply talking, the truth would eventually outrun him. If he was building something bigger, we'd know soon enough. Marva nodded. When she left, I sat alone for a while, thinking about something I'd learned much later in life than I should have. The hardest consequence is not losing people's trust. It's earning it back and discovering some people preferred the version of you that failed. Geneva called me on a Thursday evening with a tightness in her voice I hadn't heard since the day she first apologized on my porch. And she told me, without any greeting first, that a reporter from one of the city's business publications had reached out to Marsh Development's communications office that afternoon asking questions about David. I asked her what kind of questions. The kind nobody wants asked 2 weeks before a major public announcement, she said. She told me the reporter had heard some version of the story about the doorway, about David denying his own mother, and was now asking whether David's relationship with Selena had influenced any vendor decisions connected to Marsh Development. I felt my stomach tighten immediately. Not because the accusation was true, it wasn't. Callaway Cleaning Services won that contract on its numbers, the same way we'd won every contract we'd ever earned. But business has a way of treating questions and answers like they're the same thing. Sometimes all it takes is somebody asking the wrong question publicly for people to start wondering whether there might be something underneath it. I asked Geneva where the reporter got the story. She told me nobody knew for certain. What they did know was that the reporter seemed less interested in what actually happened, and more interested in whether there was a larger story hidden underneath it. A denied mother, a future father-in-law, a major contract, a company promotion that had already become office gossip. The pieces sounded dramatic enough that someone had started putting them together. I found myself thinking about the conversation Marva and I had weeks earlier, about Terrence, about stories that grow larger every time they're repeated by somebody who wasn't there. Maybe he had nothing to do with it. Maybe he did. Either way, the story had escaped the room where it started. That was the real problem. Geneva told me Prescott had already spoken with the company's legal and communications teams. The records were clean. The vendor process was documented. The scoring process was documented. Every step leading to Callaway Cleaning Services. Winning the contract could be verified on paper. That should have reassured me. Instead, it reminded me how little paper matters once people become more interested in scandal than facts. I sat quietly with the phone against my ear. For 14 years, I had built my company one client at a time. No shortcuts, no favors, no special treatment. Now a story that began with my son's shame threatened to become a story about my business. That was the first part that truly frightened me. Not because I doubted the truth, because I understood how many people never wait long enough to hear it. Geneva was quiet for a moment before speaking again. Then she told me something that mattered more than anything else she'd said. David had already gone to Prescott himself, before the reporter ever called, before anyone asked him a single question. He had sat down and given a complete written account of everything that happened, from the lie he told about me to the consequences that followed afterward. No excuses, no minimizing, no attempt to shift blame, just the truth. I closed my eyes hearing that. A year earlier, he would have tried to hide from the story. Now, he was walking directly into it. Geneva told me Prescott wanted all of us at the house that evening. Her, Prescott, Selena, David, me. Not because anyone needed to coordinate a response, The facts were already the facts. But because once a story leaves your control, the only thing left to decide is who you're going to be while it unfolds. I told her I'd come. Then I hung up and sat alone in my office for a long moment. The reporter wasn't what worried me most anymore. The story had already tested David once. What I wanted to know now was whether the man walking into that house tonight was finally different from the one who stood in that doorway. We sat in the Marsh living room past 9 that night, the 5 of us. Prescott in his usual chair, Geneva beside him, Selena and David on the couch across from me, everyone waiting to see which version of Prescott would lead this conversation. He opened by saying his first instinct, the old one his own buried shame had built in him decades ago, was to make this disappear entirely. Lawyers, a cease and desist, whatever it cost to keep the story out of daylight before the Beltline announcement. That instinct got him nowhere good the last time he followed it, he said, standing in a doorway deciding a woman was hired help before he'd heard a word out of her mouth, and he wasn't interested in repeating that mistake now with stakes this much higher. Selena told her father plainly that burying a story only confirms the worst version of it the moment it surfaces anyway, and burying this one would mean burying the truth about her own family's history along with it. I told them what I had been turning over since Geneva's call, that I would rather control my own story than let a stranger with a deadline control it for me. And I set one condition before I agreed to anything. This centers my company's win, I told Prescott, on its own merit, not David's redemption, not a tidy bow on anyone's reputation, but my own earned one. He agreed without hesitation. As for the genealogy, I told them plainly it stayed buried, mine to expose if I ever chose to, and I didn't choose to, not as leverage, not as a weapon against a family already doing the harder work of facing itself honestly. David, quiet through most of it, finally spoke, saying he wanted his name attached to the honest version too. Fully, no editing, because he was done letting fear write his story for him. Prescott called a journalist he trusted before midnight, someone who covered the city's growth rather than its gossip, and the feature ran 9 days later exactly the way we'd asked. My company's history. The contract won clean. Nothing more. Without anyone connected to the family confirming a single detail about old county filings, the original reporter's editor decided unverified genealogy claims about a private family weren't worth the legal risk of printing, and the story he'd been chasing simply died on someone else's desk before it ever ran. What none of us knew until almost 2 weeks later was where his original tip about the doorway had come from at all, until Prescott's IT department, reviewing an unrelated security audit, found an internal email trail leading back to an account registered under a barely disguised version of Terrence Boykin's own name. Prescott called him into his office that same afternoon, and David, who'd asked to be there, told me later that Terrence sat in that chair with none of the shame David himself had carried into that same room a year earlier, insisting he'd only been protecting the firm's reputation by raising legitimate concerns. Protecting a firm and destroying a colleague to clear your own path aren't the same act wearing different clothes, Prescott told him, and he was terminated within the hour, escorted out past the same procurement office where my bid had once impressed the whole building. David told me he felt no satisfaction watching it happen, only a quiet recognition of exactly how close he himself had once stood to becoming that same kind of man, the kind willing to use someone else's pain as a ladder, the shape of failure aimed outward instead of inward. The wedding took place on a clear Saturday at a garden venue on Atlanta's east side, the kind of place Geneva chose specifically because it asked nothing of anyone trying to perform wealth to belong in it. I sat in the second row, not the front, a placement Selena had insisted on weeks earlier over David's nervous suggestion that I might prefer somewhere less visible. Marva sat beside me, closer to family by then than employee in any sense that mattered. Prescott walked Selena down the aisle with the same stillness I'd come to recognize in him, a man who'd spent a lifetime curating image now standing in a moment that asked none of it from him. The ceremony moved through its vows the way ceremonies do, steady, unremarkable, until it reached the portion where the couple traditionally thanks their families, and David did something none of us expected, including me. He stepped back from Selena for a moment, turned fully toward the rows of seated guests, and spoke without a single note in his hand. Selena reached for his hand while he said it, not to quiet him, but to steady him, the way a person braces someone they trust completely to finish what they started saying. He said that everyone in that garden was witnessing the marriage of a man who had once been so afraid of where he came from that he denied the very woman who built him, standing in a doorway in front of strangers without a second of hesitation. He said the only reason he stood there whole enough to deserve the life waiting for him was because that same woman had refused to let him buy his way out of the truth with a cheap apology. Then he said my full name into a microphone in front of 200 people. Cleotha Calloway, founder of a company that built itself 14 years strong with or without his permission to claim it, the same way he had once written it gladly beneath a graduation photograph before fear convinced him to erase it. He thanked Prescott next, not for approving the marriage, which had never been his to approve, but for setting terms that never once bent for his comfort. Terms that pulled him off a career track with no promised return, and meant exactly what they said. He told the guests plainly that he was still working his way back at Marsh Development, still years away from anything guaranteed, no timeline handed to him, no shortcut earned, and that he wanted every person in that garden to understand the rise he was building belonged to no one's mercy but his own continued choices. I did not cry during the vows themselves, but I felt my throat tighten standing there watching my son claim me completely, fully, by name, in front of people who had once watched him deny me, with no hallway left to hide in, no audience he was performing for, no version of himself remaining to protect. I watched him find my eyes one last time across that garden before the music started again. And in that single look, I saw the boy who once grabbed my hand before a graduation ceremony, fully returned. Prescott caught my eye from across the garden too and gave a small nod, the kind two people exchange when they've each spent a lifetime being underestimated by rooms exactly like the one they were finally standing inside as equals. The reception that followed was warm in a way I had stopped expecting from that family. Geneva pulling me onto the dance floor at one point, laughing about something neither of us would remember by Monday. He thought that sentence in the doorway started his downfall. It started the only rise that was ever going to hold.